Hello and welcome to this special webinar series brought to you by the Master of Arts in Government program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion with Doug Harris and Michael Siegel on the state of the 2024 presidential election. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the MA in Government playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. Dorothea Wolfson, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Arts in Government program.
Thank you so much, Peter. Yes, I'm Dorothea Wolfson. I'm the Director of the MA in Government program. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are now less than 100 days away from the presidential election, which seems to have gone into hyperdrive these past 3 weeks. 20 days ago, there was an assassination attempt of former President Trump. 12 days ago, Joe Biden removed himself as the nominee of the Democratic Party and named his vice president, Kamala Harris, to replace him. This happened after weeks of infighting and intrigue among Democratic Party elites as to whether Joe Biden should stay or go after his disastrous debate results. And even earlier in May, former President Trump was found guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records. It's been a dramatic, topsy-turvy political summer of intrigue, violence, and party machinations. And we still have the DNC convention to come in Chicago in a little over 2 weeks. How are we to make sense of it all? What do all these events say about the state of American politics, its political parties, institutions, and American leadership? What should we expect come November? Well, now, while it's easy to get lost in all the partisan drama and the sound bites, this election actually raises some fundamental questions about American politics, including the role of populism embodied in Trump and the relative strength of party elites. We saw Trump blow through party elites in the GOP back in 2016, whereas party elites in the Democratic Party in 2024 dictated who their candidate would be, disregarding or bypassing the primary process. There are other foundational issues on the table, such as the Supreme Court and the separation of powers, the role of the administrative state in American democracy, and America's role in a world that is increasingly aflame. These are all questions that our two guests engage in their courses they teach and the research they do and the books they write. So we are indeed very grateful to have them here today to offer us some guidance. Now, for students in the audience today, these two need no introduction. They are both very popular and long-term faculty in the program. I'll start with Michael Siegel. Dr. Siegel teaches courses on the presidency, leadership skills, and negotiation at Hopkins. He is the author of Lessons in Leadership from the White House to Your House and The President as Leader, which is in its second edition. From 1992 to 2021, Siegel served as a senior education specialist at the Federal Judicial Center, where he designed and delivered leadership education programs to chief judges of the U.S. courts and to federal court unit executives. Dr. Siegel has served as a consultant on judicial reform and rule of law issues in the Czech Republic, Serbia, Argentina, Algeria, and the Republic of Georgia. Dr. Siegel received his PhD in political science from Tufts University and served as an Eli Lilly Endowment postdoctoral teaching fellow at Purdue University. He completed negotiation skills training at the Harvard Law School in 1992 and 2016. Next, Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris is the professor of political science at Loyola University in Maryland. Like Dr. Siegel, he teaches many of our most popular elective courses, including classes on Congress, public policy, race and politics, and American political development. His co-authored books include The Austin-Boston Connection, 50 Years of House Democratic Leadership, and Choosing the Leader, Leadership Elections in the House of Representatives. His most recent book, At War with Government, How Conservatives Weaponize Distrust from Goldwater to Trump, was co-authored with Amy Freed at the University of Maine. Dr. Harris received his PhD right here at Hopkins. So before I turn the floor over to them, I want to encourage, as Peter did, for you all to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A function. Both Dr. Siegel and Dr. Harris will make a short presentation, and then we will open it up to questions. So we will start with you, Dr. Harris.
Thank you, Dorothea. Thanks for having me. As Dr. Wolfson just recounted, so much has happened in just the last few weeks, right? There was this history-making debate, an assassination attempt in Pennsylvania, a vice presidential nomination, Republican convention with little to no bounce. The president drops out. Vice President Harris solidifies her support within the Democratic Party, and becomes the de facto nominee, and is on her way to becoming the actual nominee. What strikes me about this election, and in some ways this is basically what was striking to me about the last election, is that there is this inertial quality, or this resistance of the party electoral system to all of this change. At its broadest level, not much has changed, right? So at the time of the Trump-Biden debate, and even in the days after, we had more or less a coin toss race with about 10%, a little more of the electorate still undecided. With all of that change, we're still more or less a coin toss race with about 10%, maybe a little less, undecided. That is, with all that is seemingly in flux, for me, the key question is, what are the structural anchors that led the overall election to be less subject to these big events and changes than we might expect? And then what are the prospects for movement or change, especially in the wake of these events and as the last less than 100 days of the campaign proceed? So one of the anchors that I want to talk about is what political scientists would call retrospectivity. A great mid-20th century political scientist who spent some of his time teaching at Johns Hopkins, V.O. Key Jr., observed that national elections are usually retrospective in nature. That is, voters vote to reward or punish the party in power for its performance. He famously called the electorate the rational god of punishment and reward. Under normal circumstances, this would be bad news for Biden and the Democrats, because presidential approval is quite low in what we used to call Carter country, and the public mood is pretty sour. So a straight referendum on Biden, fair or not, given the record, but a straight referendum on Biden would have been a pretty clear President Nikki Haley. But the Republicans wouldn't have it. That Trump, a former president himself, was running to unseat the incumbent president complicated the simple lesson of retrospectivity, because Trump had his own retrospective record to be evaluated. And would the 2024 election be a referendum on Biden's term in office, or would it be, like 2020, another referendum on Trump's performance during his term in office? So that complicated the situation a bit. I'll also say negativity seems to be one of the anchors here. As I said, the public mood, despite overall economic performance, is sour. But that was true too in 2019 and 2020. And Trump's candidacy brings back the negativity that sparked his unpopular presidency and his ouster. One of the factors I think contemporary political scientists have been thinking about, even if it was always true, is negative partisanship, right? So it's always been a factor in elections, but the contemporary era seems to be marked by a good deal more negative voting. That is, instead of voting because you like or are satisfied with your party and its candidates, voters are just as apt and perhaps more motivated to vote against the other party out of what Hunter Thompson would call fear and loathing. Trump's 2016 candidacy was built to a large degree on distrusters of the establishment, fundamental distrust in Washington politics. Trump's performance and persona in turn, went a long way to galvanizing Democrats' antipathy to the MAGA movement as either dangerous, too cozy with what were once marginalized hate groups, or as they say these days, just weird. So I suspect that this negativity will be more motivating than any positivity or hope that can be mustered in less than 100 days before the election. The good news for Vice President Harris that I think comes out of that is that she seems to have gotten very little slippage from Biden's coalition, because Biden's coalition, there were certainly pro-Biden voters, right? And there's a lot of affection, I think, for President Biden in some circles. But a lot of the Biden coalition was an anti-Trump coalition, and Harris steps in as the new anti-Trump candidate. I think Harris also has one potential advantage too, in that a lot of people who were looking at the stasis of this election were talking about what are called double haters. This group of people who were opposed to both Biden and Trump and were just wishing for an alternative. Well, Biden gave them the opportunity to have an alternative to that. And I think the question is, how will Harris fare in the next 90 some days with these voters? To what extent can the Trump campaign affiliate her and cement the affiliation with Biden and whatever negativity is there? Or was the opposition to Biden more about age and acuity concerns, and thus, and that was a lot of the Trump and Republican messaging. So in some ways, they've been caught flat-footed with this change, because there was certainly an anti-Biden sense to what they were doing. The last two gravitational pulls or inertial factors. One, polarization, obviously. This is, I think, one of the effects of polarization, which is we seem to be resistant to performance. We seem to be largely resistant to message. We seem to be resistant to pandemics, assassination attempts, good and bad vice presidential choices. So there are 5 states that are toss-ups. There were 5 states that were toss-ups before the debate. There were maybe 2 or 3 that are gettable for Democrats besides those toss-ups, Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. The two for Democrats might be Georgia or North Carolina. 2 or 3 are gettable for Republicans, maybe New Hampshire on a good day, or Minnesota. The Trump campaign keeps talking about, but 80% of the states are probably already decided. The last thing I'll talk about, which has its own inertial quality, is Trumpism. There are factors related to Trumpism that make his electoral strength particularly immune to performance and events. Trump's support did not evaporate after COVID. It pretty much stayed the same. I tracked that 2020 election. The story a month before the election was Biden's up probably on polling averages of 7 or 8 points. That was the story in January. And it was pretty much a flat line throughout. This has been true. This inertial quality has been true of Trump's presidency generally. Whereas presidents typically have broad approval ranges, the difference between their high and their low throughout the first term is what I measured. Some ranges between as much as 25 and 50 points going back to Eisenhower. Trump had not only the lowest average first-term approval prior to Biden, I haven't run those numbers yet, but also the smallest range, which was a 9-point range. So as we move into 2024, this all remains the physical laws of Trumpism. Trump has a committed base, but a low ceiling. A majority has not supported him, and that seems unlikely to change. I think that there are some prospects for change. There seems to be a lot of excitement on the Democratic side There seems to be a lot, I mean, the sort of secondary indicators of giving and new registration and volunteer signups and campaign activity, those all seem to be up. But this political scientist wants more evidence before I'm moving this anywhere from the coin flip race I had it when Joe Biden was still in. I think Harris has a better chance of getting those who are truly undecided at this point. But that's going to take messaging from the campaign, successful convention, good VP choice. There's for Harris, I think the prospects are brighter, but there's a lot of work to be done. And I'll leave it at that.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Harris. And okay, Dr. Siegel.
Well, that's a hard act to follow, but I'll do my best. Thank you for that excellent analysis, Doug, and I've learned quite a bit in these few minutes. I will say that I think Harris is attempting to project a very positive image and to get people excited. And so far, it seems to be working. As he indicated, it may not sustain over time. But I think one of the things a presidential candidate has to do is to project some vision, some positive vision for the country, some message, as he puts it, to get people excited about the candidacy, even if that message is going to resonate with only 10% who are convertible. It's still important to work on it, and so as not to lose the already committed, although, as he indicated, people are pretty dug in. And in fact, I saw a recent political science study on the issue of polarization that says when young people come to tell their parents they're getting married, the first question from the parents is not what gender, what religion, what race, what party. And this is how bad things are, and it does pervade all the way throughout the polity, I believe. As I said, I think presidents have to do 4 things, and I'll talk a little bit about them, and then we'll really be interested in your questions. And I think that, by the way, I stopped making predictions after 2016, where I, along with everybody else, thought that Hillary was going to win by a pretty significant margin. A president has to set out, a presidential candidate has to set out a vision. What's your purpose? What do you aspire to? You know, Joe Biden entered the race, as he says, because of the events that unfolded in Charlottesville. And his vision at that point was unity. He wanted to unify the country back to its roots, back to what he calls its soul, the soul of America. I'm sorry, which he got from John Meacham. But that was his initial premise. And also, of course, to fight the COVID situation. And that's those are the things that motivated him to get in. And those are the things he tried to deliver on. I think once in office, I think his vision expanded significantly to where he was always known as a moderate. He became quite active in the LBJ FDR sense of the word, in taking government to help people in direct ways, in building these large infrastructure programs, climate change, and so forth. And now in his last address, he's come back when he withdrew to this more grandiose global purpose of saving democracy. But in all phases, whether they are indeed phases or not, he did propose to have a vision, to have a purpose. And so that's what a president has to do. The Republicans, in my mind right now, are not strong on that. They did not really have much visionary activity in the convention. It was all about strength and, victory. And there was very little about policy and about direction. In 2020, they didn't even bother to change the Republican platform. They just lived with the one they had in 2016. The one body of work that was purporting to be a vision statement, Project 2020, 2025, Trump is now backing away from. So I don't see a coherent message from the Republicans. And in this vacuum, I think Kamala Harris has the opportunity to construct a very compelling, positive message of inclusivity, of change, of adaptation, and so forth. And I think you will see her, I think, working on that. The second thing a president has to do is to implement their vision. How do you execute on your vision? Mario Cuomo once said you can campaign in poetry, but you must govern in prose. And so you have to actually know the details of how to get things done. Now, Kamala Harris has served only about 5 years in the Senate, but she has to have some notion of how things work, of how to get committees active, of how to get votes. And in Washington, even though we think it's largely about vision and imagination, it's also largely about numbers, which is why Nancy Pelosi once said, "Some people dream about sheep, I dream about votes." And so it's a question of mathematics, and what kind of majority will she have, if any, in either chamber to work with? This is going to be very important to her getting things done. The third thing a president has to do is to manage this enormous workforce called the federal executive branch, which has at least 4 million people in it. If you count contractors, it has 7 million. The president is largely is technically responsible for the behavior and the production of all those 7 million people. Obviously, that's not going to happen, but the president then has a cabinet to rely on. Who will he or she appoint as cabinet secretaries? How well does he know the business of the cabinet agencies? We have a lot of scorn these days for outsiders. But frankly, it takes an insider to understand, like Joe Biden, with 36 years experience in the Senate, how do you do deals? How do you do negotiations? How do you do bipartisan? According to the journalists, he was responsible for 300 bipartisan bills. In this environment, I would say that's incredible. And finally, what a president has to do is how do you make decisions? Who do you include in your decision-making process? What venue do you choose? How much are you open to dissenting opinions? How comfortable are you with following up on your decisions? These are all things that are incumbent for presidential candidates and presidents to do. So with those 4 vectors or metrics, I think we can perhaps have a conversation about how well Harris or Trump would do in those 4, and I'm gonna keep my comments to that at this point.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I encourage audience to put your questions in the Q&A function. And I think I'll start with one for both of you to address, because I thought, Dr. Harris, that you really brought out the fact that it does seem like we are, the political scene has seemed so much in flux, so much upheaval, unprecedented happenings. Yet things haven't really changed that much due to the polarization that people still seem to be locked. There hasn't been much movement. And I guess my question would be, what will it take to reach that 10% for either candidate to do? Both of them have their limitations. Kamala didn't go through a primary process, right? She hasn't been vetted. She didn't do well when she tried to run, right, back in 2020. So what will it take as far as where we are as an electorate right now? What is the nature of the polarization? I mean, right now we seem to have this populist moment where the working class are united behind Trump and the college-educated voters are more united with Kamala. Where is the twain between these two, and what would Kamala or Trump have to do to reach them? And I guess I would ask that to you as well, Michael, as far as with your vectors, what areas could both of them, for Trump or Kamala, do? It seems like the ball's in Kamala's court, right? Because she's the fresh face, and she doesn't have whether she is associated with Biden, who was very unpopular too. But anyway, if you could unpack that a little bit and share, we'll start with you, Doug, how to break the inertia.
Yeah, well, I think that breaking that inertia has always been Donald Trump's problem as a candidate, even when he won. Trying to reach that outer group of voters that would give him the majority that has eluded him throughout. I think for him to do that, the Trump campaign is going to have to characterize Harris in very negative ways, and I think perhaps some of that has already started. But trying to mine her record for votes. I mean, this is the inconvenient thing about being a senator running, a former senator running for president. You take a lot of votes, and that record is going to be something that they frankly should have gone through before Biden dropped out. And they do seem to have been caught flat-footed by this. But I think it's probably fair to assume that there will also be some parts of the Trump coalition that will talk, as they have in the last couple of days, about questions of race, some pretty antiquated notions about gender and women as leaders will surface. Basically, I don't think that those messages themselves will reach that last 10%. That's already baked into the coalition, but and a generalized sense that Harris is somehow other and untested and untrustable seems to be, I'm sorry to say, the path for Trump to sort of break into that last group. I think for Harris, I think Michael's absolutely right. For all the retrospectivity of campaigns, they have to be about the future. And Harris, in a way that Biden simply could not, he was ill cast for that role. Harris can make this an election, not just young old, but new old, future past. And I think there will be a mix for Harris of casting that perspective evaluation, but also trying to remind people of the last year of the Trump presidency. I wouldn't be surprised if we started to hear about lost jobs, bleach injections, and do you remember when you couldn't get toilet paper? And that was an important part of the Trump record. That plus January 6th really makes for the possibility that Harris's appeal will be not just a futuristic appeal, but also, do we really want to go back to that or stay in that Trump moment?
So it sounds like it's going to be a negativity will reign again on both sides, maybe with Kamala having more ability to project the vision that Michael was speaking of. Michael?
Yeah, I think part of the vision will be things like reproductive freedom for women, reproductive health for women will be a very key issue that they will focus on in terms of looking forward. And, the number of states where women absolutely will not be able to get an abortion for any reason coming up. I think they will have a strong focus on that. I think they also might appeal to people to think about the Supreme Court, which is in its lowest popularity rating in many, many years. And as you know, is awash with scandals and problems and problematic decisions, according to many. But mostly the whole question of entitlement of the justices and being kind of above it all. As you know, Biden and Harris have now put forward, reform legislation, and I think that will actually become somewhat of it might become a campaign issue. But I think also the thing that they will focus on is the creation of jobs under their administration and how many jobs they created.
Yeah.
And it's been remarkable. And, the only thing the Republicans convey is the inflation, but the other side of that is more people are working and are able to pay their bills and so forth. So, it's going to be tough. As Doug says, there's a There's a lot of negativity. There's no question about that. But I think, there are positive messages, positive appeals that can be made. And, a lot of it is also theater and the way you package things. And again, even slogans and things like this. And of course, they will be very pro kitten in this.
Right. Yeah, and she's drawing big crowds. You do sense the energy and the momentum, and on Kamala's part, and we'll see how long that lasts with the theater part. But you were speaking about jobs in the economy, and Dr. Pascal, who teaches in the program, runs the data analytics program. He has a question which goes along these lines. He asked, this morning's job report was below expectations, and under some definitions signals the start of a recession. The Fed is likely to cut rates later this fall, but some would say too late. How much should we expect macroeconomic conditions to affect the elections in the next few months, aside from a huge financial crisis or an outlier like that? Is that all baked in at this point? Again, is this all, again, sort of set, or will it nudge things in one way or the other for Trump, I suppose, right? If it does go south.
I mean,
does that still matter to people, or is polarization so strong that wouldn't even move the needle?
Well, I can take a stab at that.
Sure.
The irony when you mention polarization is that people interpret economic data through their polarized lens.
True.
So George Packer, in a recent Atlantic Monthly article, talked about unbridgeable realms of truth. Unbridgeable realms of truth.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that even economic data is seen through partisan eyes. I will say, I don't think one, bad month, so to speak, will determine people's views long range about the effect of the Biden-Harris administration on the economy. And I think they can be very proud of creating 14 million jobs. And I think they will go forward with that message, anticipating they will be attacked about inflation, and they will be. And that's a very real issue. And that's the one kind of issue that possibly cuts through polarization. Although how bad it is probably a function of who you are, how you define it. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just say, I think the job growth in today's report was less than expected, but that follows on, I think, two past reports where they were more than expected. And you would have to, my sense of it is that politically you'd have to see another week report and a third week report before that really becomes a problem, because the more people are thinking and talking about jobs, the better the Biden and Harris administration looks.
Right. Great. Well, there's another question here from Augustina Howe, and she asked, is there a way to prevent a politician like Trump from pushing through the system again? And I think this gets to one of the big questions here, which is the surge of populism in our democracy today. And we've always had surges of populism. Sometimes they're from the left, sometimes from the right. We're on the right now with the populism. And populism is usually viewed as, we sort of cast it in negative light, but there are healthy forms of populism. It's listening to the people. We are a democracy after all. But this is, I think, a great question insofar as we are in this populist movement. And what, on the terms for leadership, Michael, how is it that a leader, right? Trump still seems to get through the system. What would it take to prevent that, I suppose, as the question poses? But is this a reflection of some sort of resonance that he has had with the electorate? He has really mobilized the working class. There's been a huge shift in support among the working class that has moved from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. What is the Democratic, well, sort of, instead of, it's easy to beat up on Trump, but what has the Democratic Party not done, right, that has allowed Trump to tap into this very important base in American politics?
So if you're asking me to,
well, you can start, or either. Yeah.
I'll start. So the notion of pushing through the system is kind of an interesting one, to use the questioner's words. As you said, Dorothea, in your introduction, or as Doug may have said, he campaigned as an anti-establishment leader, and certainly he and Steve Bannon were determined to break what they call the administrative state, the deep state. And he tried very hard to do that. And as many of us would observe, the guardrails held to a large extent. And he wasn't able to, as she says, push through the system entirely. The system worked in terms of the checks and balances, at least in some respects. The issue now is that, as I mentioned, the Supreme Court has taken away some of those guardrails, frankly, with its immunity decision, which guarantees him basically immunity from criminal prosecution, no matter what he does going forward, which is, in my mind, extremely problematic. By the way, that's another part of Biden's reform effort here. The Chevron decision, the decision to overturn the Chevron rule and the administrative sort of prerogative that's in that is another guardrail that's been taken down. He has, if he's to be believed in Project 2025, this notion of a Schedule F employees, which would basically rid them of all protections and would allow him to appoint loyalists. So there's many guardrails that would, I think, frankly, to the answers to the questioner's question, give him more capacity to push through the system. I don't think, it would be absolute, but it would be perhaps more extreme than in his first term. And I think the way to stop him, is through the ballot box. And he's been stopped. His party has been stopped many times. 2022, the congressional elections, the various votes on abortion rights in states like Kansas. So the population can be mobilized to defeat this, but I think she's raising a very legitimate question.
Right.
Yeah, and because Michael covered that part of it so well, I'll just talk about the nomination process, because when I go back to 2016, I think because of Trump's persona and his past, I would at that point talk about his hostile takeover of the Republican Party, that there were a lot of elites that were just sort of pushed aside. They at the time were talking about how dangerous he was and how dangerous that populism that he represented could be, only to switch later, of course. But the same thing was happening on the Democratic side, as a non-Democrat was competing pretty vigorously for the Democratic nomination. I'm talking about Bernie Sanders. And
Right.
It seems to me that what this points out is one of the things that has that I think typifies this age and distinguishes it from past ages, which is, in the past, when party organizations were strong, partisanship generally was strong. And sometimes that would be low, and sometimes it would be high, sometimes it would be low again. And what we see in this polarized era, in my mind, is partisanship, what I call partisanship without parties. That we have really high levels of partisanship, high levels of polarization, the affective polarization that Michael was talking about, and all of that, but we don't have strong organizational parties. So the Republican Party was this hollow vehicle that Trump could just take over and ride, that Sanders tried. The Democratic Party was this empty vehicle that Sanders tried to control. It gives you ballot access. It gives you a lot of resources, but there's not a lot of pushback. And one of the things that I think would be important would be a reconsideration of what it means to organize a political party, and to build up party organizations at the grassroots, at the state level, and not to become undemocratic, but to become, the democratic republic that I always thought we were, which was, there would be this populist sense, and there would also be this for lack of a better way to describe it, this elite voice that would sometimes push back against that populist sentiment and sometimes give into it. And here you're going to hear somebody, probably the only person who's going to say it. How about some more super delegates?
Yeah.
How about some stronger party organization? Why don't we make it harder for somebody who had given money to Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton becoming the Republican nominee for president, not once, but twice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right that these parties have been hollowed out, and you always have needed sort of gatekeeping roles that the parties elites have played, and they did in terms of that. It seems like the Democratic Party is in better shape. Look what just happened. They all agreed. They came together. Maybe it was non-smoking rooms, but they decided it was going to go, that Biden had to go out and it was going to go to Kamala, right? And they all converged around that. Whereas I almost think, I want you can comment on this. It almost seems like if the Republicans lose, if Trump loses, it might be in the long run the best thing for the Republican Party to then maybe regroup, like you said, Doug, and try to find their way back to, if it's even possible, I'm not sure, to the kind of more Reagan coalition. I mean, that just seems so dead right now, and that has served, the party pretty well, bringing a fusion of interests together. And I wonder what you think about that. Like, if what happens if either party loses? Might it be good for the party? Although maybe more so for the Republicans than the Democrats.
I think it's right. I mean, one of the things I've been saying for a while is one of the things this country needs and is missing is a functioning Republican Party. It has produced so much of value, and I think you in your lead up to that point, Dorothea, you brought up an interesting point, which is maybe they need to lose. Right? Loss is what teaches you to innovate, right? A great political scientist, Ted Lowy, pointed that out about political parties. The innovative parties are the parties that have lost, or the minority parties. They're trying new things. And I wrote something for a conference about a half a year ago, where I said one of the real problems for the Republican Party through the 2020 election denial was that enough of them believed that Trump had won that they didn't feel the need to innovate. They decided to run a retread candidate who had lost instead of DeSantis, who would have looked pretty strong, I think, eventually against Biden, and Haley, who I think was a knockout punch.
That is a truly lost, I'm sorry, that is such a truly lost opportunity. And I think you're absolutely right, because there was this sense that we didn't lose, it was stolen, so we don't need to change anything. And they had, all the polls show that Haley would have beaten Biden. She would have probably beaten Kamala, I think. I mean, she would have drawn so many voters, and they just looked success in the face, and they walked away from it. So it's really interesting, and I do think not viewing it as a loss even, but they were robbed somehow. I think that's a great point.
I agree with both of you, and unfortunately, the last time they tried to do it didn't go very well, which was after the Obama election. The second one, they did what Reince Priebus called an autopsy, and they were supposed to make themselves more, appealable to minorities and so forth. And then they got eclipsed by Trump somehow, and they never really completed that. But I think you're right. I think a loss would create the potential for them to take a look at themselves and reconstitute themselves as a viable party. I totally agree with Doug. We need a viable Republican Party.
And I suppose if the Democrats lost, they might then, I mean, I think of their base as the working class for so many years, the FDR coalition, and they might rediscover, I don't know, maybe figure out ways of reaching those voters who have sort of abandoned the Democratic Party in pretty large numbers, at least among the white working class.
And I just add, specifically among rural voters, I don't think Democrats will win rural voters, but if they only lost by less, they'd be they'd be in a much stronger position. I always feel the responsibility to say, however, when I bring that point up, that the Republicans should also take the leadership of America's cities a little more seriously themselves.
Yes,
That would
yes.
broaden that coalition in a pretty significant way too.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we have some more questions in the chat. This one is, do you think that important aid such as student aid and financial support for students will be directly impacted depending on which candidate is elected? These are big questions for our audience. Does the president really have the power to directly and immediately make changes to certain federal programs that give support to certain groups?
Yeah, those are good questions. I do think it would make an enormous difference which party won on that, on the student aid question. I think the Democrats would be much more inclined to pursue that than the Republicans. I haven't heard any discussion of that among Republicans at all. Whether the president has unilateral power, of course, that was another thing that the Supreme Court knocked down. And in this case, perhaps for better cause. I don't think the president does have that unilateral power, but he certainly has the power to propose legislation in that area and to lobby for it and so forth.
Yeah.
And I just add that the vice presidential candidate on the Republican side has been quoted as saying professors are the enemy. Forgive me for my antenna going up when that was said. I think what would be called reform of higher education would be clearly on the agenda of Trump-Vance administration Department of Education, so long as it lasts. Maybe it would be the last thing a Department of Education did. But it would certainly have big effects on the financing of education, and I think the structure and whatever independence of higher education. I almost said it in a way that was a little too negative. Whatever is left. I was trained by Ben Ginsberg, so
yeah, that's right. You have to be provocative, right?
I'll say the great thing about American higher education is its independence and its research and its teaching, and that needs to be supported.
Of course, absolutely. Michael, you used the word unilateralism, and I think we've seen so much of that in the executive power on both sides, right? I mean, there's been this great concentration in the executive branch, and that I think that's what's that also contributes to the heightened polarization in national elections and all those things. And you mentioned how Trump wants to go after the administrative state, and that's an attack on democracy. I'm just curious though, what you think, and maybe what about Biden's attack on the Supreme Court and the reforms that he is projecting. They're pretty radical reforms that, putting an 18-year term limit on them, and there's no term limits in the Constitution. I mean, should we be concerned about that from a perspective of democracy and the executive branch overreaching here to try to control the Supreme Court? This is your area. I know you've advised other countries about judicial reforms. Is this too much? I mean, that Biden has suggested?
I think you raise a very legitimate question, and overreach is overreach, no matter which side of the aisle it's on. And arguably, this is a matter of overreach. One of the ideas is to create a different kind of judicial officer that wouldn't have roots in Article 3, so to speak, but would have more legislative roots. So it would be an 18-year term. That could probably be done through statute rather than a constitutional amendment. I mean, in order to get rid of lifetime tenure, you would literally have to amend the Constitution, and we know how easy that is. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I guess the notion of the unitary executive seems to be popular among Trump acolytes, and was popular even in George W. Bush's administration, during the Iraq War and so forth. But I don't think, my personal reading of the Constitution is that the president exists in a check and balance system, and everything he does or she does is subject to the other branches' collaboration, or at least involvement of some kind, and he can't the president can't just run roughshod over the entire system, which may mean, no, you can't introduce the forgiving of student loans unilaterally. You can't do it. You know, you can't set up, in commissions, war commissions on your own. You need Congress's involvement. So yeah, I think there's fairness in what you're saying, that a unilateral act on a Republican and a Democrat is equally offensive to some parts of the Constitution. Yes.
Oh, interesting. And yeah, and then I also wonder too, even with the Chevron, I wanted to get Doug's opinion on that. You mentioned it, that what does this mean in terms of a Congress, right? Is there a sense, we talk about the executive and how strong it's become. And maybe one of the silver linings of Chevron would be that Congress might reassert itself a little bit more vis-a-vis the executive branch.
I think that is a hope. In my years of sort of following the Chevron doctrine and how courts would interpret it now throughout its lifespan, I think this was something that Antonin Scalia would always point to, which was, well, if only Congress did its job.
Yeah.
If Congress was more explicit, this would not be a problem. I think in part the problem there is that whatever Congress is able to do legislatively requires either an override size coalition or presidential approval. And right now, that's really difficult for Congress to achieve, because there does seem to be this resurgence of a presidency court alliance that sort of typified the end of the 19th century. And as a result, Congress can do a lot, and it can be very specific, and it can get vetoed by a president or overruled by a court. Between that question and what Michael just said, it led me to think, as I've been thinking since Chevron, since Loper, we need a more robust understanding of separation of powers. There was this new separation of powers definition that sort of emerged in the Office of Legal Counsel in the Meese administration, in the Reagan administration under Ed Meese, which was that these institutions are separate and self-governing and self-sustaining. That was a remarkable leap compared to a lot of things that had been said before, which is these are institutions that check and balance one another. These are institutions that are mutually interdependent and in mutual conversations. Every old model got put aside, and it became the Kavanaugh-Thomas understanding of separation of powers, and seemingly perhaps even Roberts' understanding of powers, that these institutions are in and of themselves uncheckable except by something explicit in the Constitution. And that's a radical leap in separation of powers understandings that I think has proven pretty dangerous and gave us this immunity decision that is abusable in pretty extreme ways.
Yeah. All right. We have another question in the chat from Kathleen Cook. In modern history, the number of swing states has decreased greatly, and I'm curious to know why that is, and what does that mean for our system of government and presidential leadership?
I'm
Doug?
going to refer to
go
Doug.
ahead.
Yeah,
Oh,
Doug.
Doug? Okay,
Let
go ahead.
I think the number has decreased mostly as we've become more polarized. And it used to be that you could have a state that was predominantly Republican, but if the Democrats ran a moderate, they could win Georgia, as I think Bill Clinton did in '92. They could win a handful of states that were traditionally Republican states. And that was in some ways a really functioning system of governance, because the parties understood that they had to lead the entire country. And as the voters have become more locked in and less persuadable, the parties devote their resources to the handful of really competitive states, and that number keeps dwindling, right? It used to be, as the great Tim Russert would say, Florida, Florida, Florida. And I remember John Kerry in the last weeks of 2004 going hunting in Ohio. I'm not a big hunter, but I'd like to have my Democrats going hunting in Ohio,
Yeah.
and I'd like to have my Republicans visiting Philadelphia. We'd have a much better party system and a much more competitive one. And the last thing I'll say about that is, who really loses from that lack of competition is the voter, who has a really hard time having an effect on actual outcomes. And when the voters are angry about something, they just feel frustrated, because whatever choice they're going to make gets filtered through an elaborate system of parties and electoral college mechanisms that make it really hard for them to feel like it matters all that much.
That's right. I think a lot of voters feel that way depending on where they live. And like it used to be the moderates, right? But and we see Kamala doing this. She's trying to move more to the center, right? In order to attract those swing voters. And to that end, I will ask you if you could predict who do you think she will choose as her, or who should she choose? Who should she choose as her VP candidate? Not that VP candidates make that much of a difference, but it does seem it might, because she really does need to present herself or divest herself from her record, at least in the past, right, as the most liberal senator, according to some website, and present herself as more moderate. So who would help her the most? I mean, they all seem to be pretty moderate, those that she is choosing among.
My view is, and I should say, I'm not part of the vetting, so I don't know what problems may have been raised. But my guess, my second choice would be Kelly. My first choice would be Shapiro.
Okay. How about you, Michael?
I may reverse the order, but the same two names appear. And I just wanted to make one comment about the swing states. Another thing that really, really is important is turnout. And I mean, there's such a stunning statistic about 2016 that ultimately made the difference in the swing states. 2 million fewer African Americans voted in that election, which made such an enormous difference in those states that Trump carried ultimately. So that's the only thing Doug, I think, did an excellent job on that. I just wanted to add that.
And Michael, if I had been asked that question yesterday, I would have said it in reverse. And tomorrow I'll probably believe that question.
Well, yeah. we'll have to check in with both of you then and see once the pick is made. But well, I think we are actually out of time. So I want to thank everyone who joined us today on your busy Friday afternoons. And of course, I want to thank Dr. Siegel and Dr. Harris for talking with us and sharing all their insights that help us to make sense of all the noise out there. I mean, again, there's so many sound bites, there's so many blogs, there's so much partisanship out there. But I think we see some larger trends from here and things to look out for in the next 90 or so days until the election, and it's very helpful. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.